Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be learning with everyone here as part of the Spherismon at Drisha. And welcome to the sixth session of Mission in Depth, Nazir and Sotah. And I believe this is the second session on Sotah. This course is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein as Etzel Mishnah division and sponsored in memory of Rifka Rosenwein. Okay. So as usual, I am inviting everyone to join as a panelist. That means that you'll be able to unmute when we pause for questions, and we'll get to see your faces if you so choose. Um, okay, and in between those moments when we're pausing for questions, it would be great if you could stay muted. And if you have any questions, you can also put them into the chat here on Zoom or into the comments on Facebook Live, and I will make sure they get to Rabbi Walfish. Okay, and with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maxine, and welcome to everyone. Okay, we're last time we only made minimal progress at the beginning of Sotah. We sort of had a kind of introduction to tractate Sotah, and we made a few points about the first few Mishnayot, but we basically didn't cover that much in the first two chapters. This week we have the next two chapters, Gimel and Dalid. So what I'd like to do is start with an overview of the first four chapters of Sotah. Okay? By the time we're finished, we will have an overview of the whole Masechet, and I think we'll find some very, very interesting things about the overall structure of Tractate Sotah. But for now, we'll start off with our overview of the first four chapters. One of the interesting things about Tractate Sotah is that a large portion of it has very little to do with Sotah. That's not all that unusual in Mishnah tractates, but it's quite noteworthy in Tractate Sotah. The first four chapters are very much focused on Sotah. Even though, as we'll see, there are a couple of excursions where the Mishnah departs from the path of examining Sotah and discusses some other things. We'll get to that, but let's start off with the mainstay. Okay, so the first four chapters are all about Sotah, and let's get an overview. I'd like to look at what each chapter deals with, and as we're doing that, I think we'll already get a pretty good sense of how these chapters are divided, the basic skeletal structure of the chapters, and what each chapter is contributing. Okay, so the first three chapters are what scholars today like to call narrative chapters. Even though the Mishnah is very largely halachic meaning that it presents things in halachic language, okay? And there are two kinds of halachic language you can find in the Mishnah, what scholars like to call apodictic, okay? Apodictic is imperative voice, okay? You simply say, do this, don't do that, okay? Lo tirtzach, do not murder, okay? That's an apodictic statement. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. Observe the Shabbat day to make it holy. Those are apodictic statements. You just issue an imperative. Okay, and much of the Mishnah is apodictic in that sense. But a good part of the Mishnah is what scholars call casuistic. Okay, casuistic means you have an if-then formulation. Okay, casuistic means basically case law. Okay, so you present the case and say, in case X, you should do Y. Okay, so you'll have a lot of Mishnayot that say, let's say, Shor shenagachet para. Okay, if an ox gored a cow and afterwards, and the cow was pregnant, and afterwards you find the fetus, and it's not clear when the fetus was born, before the goring or after the goring, what do I do with that? So that's casuistic. You present the case and then say, okay, what do I do in this case? The main part of the Mishnah is one of those two forms. But there are parts of the Mishnah that are actually presented as a narrative. They say, in a certain kind of procedure, okay, one does this, one does that, one did this, one did that, or he would go here, he would do that. So, for example, you can find, let's say, when the Mishnah is describing procedures in the temple, they're very often described in narrative form. So Tractate Yoma will tell you a narrative about the Kohen Gadol's service on Yom Kippur. The Sechet Sukkah will tell you a narrative about how they performed the water libation. Okay, and these are presented as narratives. Okay, they would do this, they would do that, they would go here and they would go there. Okay, that's a narrative form. And that's the basic form of Sotah as well. The first 3 of the 4 chapters, okay, are basically most of it is a narrative form. Okay, starting, let's say, from chapter 1, Mishnah 3 in the middle. Okay, after several either apodictic or casuistic statements in the first 2 Mishnayot, starting from the middle of chapter of Mishnah Gimel. Okay, let's start with that one. Yeah, here we go. Ketzad Osela. Okay. See, you have the translation here. Yeah. Like, what does her husband do with her, right? Ketzad Osela. Molicha leveitin sheboto makom umosrin lo shnei tamidei chachamim. Notice the present tense. This is what we do. This is what he would do. Okay, they would give him 2 Talmidei Chachamim to guard them along the way. And then the next Mishnah opens with Hayuma alino talveitin. They would bring her up to the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. Ve'omrim la, and they would say to her, okay, im amrat me'ani. This is back to casuistic. Okay, if she said Tmeani, then Shover Ksuatav Yotzeit. Vim Amra Torani. There's a bit of a departure from the narrative, but then it will go back to the narrative, further along. Okay, V'acharkach. Let's see here in Mishnah Vav. V'acharkach mevi chevel mitzri, and then he would bring an Egyptian rope and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the basic skeletal structure of the first 3 chapters, is the narrative. So now, what does the narrative focus on in each chapter? So in chapter 1, okay, chapter 1, as we've seen, opens with what the Mishnah calls kinui, from the word kin'ah. Lekane. Okay, and kinui is a term taken from the Torah's description of the Sotah in the book of Bamidbar, but Chazal give it a very interesting twist, as we saw last week, that kinui is not just the husband became suspicious. Okay, a wave of suspicion washed over him. The way Chazal understand the kinui is that the husband warns her, you and that guy, I don't like what's happening between you. Stay away from him. Do not seclude yourself with that man. And then after the kinui, you have the stira. She does seclude herself with that very man, and that's what makes her into a sotah. So that's what we started with. And then, as we saw a couple of minutes ago, in Mishnah Gimel, we start to describe what does he do now. Now that she has violated his warning, his kinui, and she has gone into seclusion, 2 witnesses, and all this in front of witnesses. There are witnesses to the kinui. There are witnesses to the fact that she checked into the hotel with that man. Okay, and now that we have very strong grounds for suspicion, now we pick up with the narrative. The husband comes to the court in his city. They send 2 Talmidei Chachamim to accompany them along the way up to Yerushalayim. They come to Yerushalayim, and in Mishnah Dalid, they came to the high court, the Sanhedrin, in Yerushalayim. Okay, they would then warn her, admonish her, basically try to get her to confess. Note that given the way that Chazal have structured the case of the Sotah, there is a strong presumption of guilt. Okay? Again, this is the way Chazal construe the psukim. The psukim seem to have a more arbitrary husband who just decides, for whatever reason, to suspect his wife, perhaps justly, perhaps unjustly. But the way Chazal present it, you start off the bat with strong grounds for presuming guilt, and so the Sanhedrin try to get her to confess. And in order, and one of the things they tell her, and this is an important point that we will pick up on a bit further down the line in Mishnah Dalid, okay, Asi lishmo hagadol shenichtav bikdusha shelo yimachel amayim. Okay, from the point of view of Chazal, this is perhaps the most serious thing that happens in the Nazir, in the rather Sotah procedure. Okay, act for the sake of his great name, so that his name, which is written in sanctity, shall not be erased on the water, to erase the word of God. Okay? However it turns out, whether it turns out she's guilty or innocent, one thing has been done that, in general, the Torah eschews. Okay? The Torah absolutely prohibits, and the Torah considers to be one of the worst things that a human being can do, to erase the name of God. Because as we'll see in chapter 3, there is a parasha of Sotah that is written. Okay, chapter 2 rather. There's a parasha of Sotah that is written, and that parasha, which contains the name of God multiple times, is then erased into the bitter waters. The bitter waters contain, among other things, okay, the erased name of God. It's actually an erased Torah passage, but that includes also erased name of God. And so the Beit Din implores this woman, please save us that. Admit your guilt. You'll walk out of here a free woman. You'll be divorced. She will forfeit her ketubah, okay, because of this strong presumption of guilt. But other than that, there are no other repercussions. And this way, we save the need to defile God's name by erasing it. Okay, that's an integral part of the procedure. Okay, this all happens in the high court. Then, if she indeed accedes to the court's request and says, yes, I am guilty, so then, as we said, they let her go, she'll be divorced, and she'll be a free woman, no further repercussions. If, however, not, if she insists on going through with the procedure, and this again, by the way, is a very interesting conception on the part of Chazal, which is the whole Sotah procedure takes place only if both parties are interested. If the husband says, you know what, I'm convinced she's guilty, I want out, I want to divorce her, she has forfeited her ketubah because of this strong presumption of guilt, I'm going to divorce her, and that'll be the end of it. That's the end of it. And if she says, I'm not going through with this, she can admit guilt, as the Beit Din is trying to lead her to do, or she can just say, I'm out of here. I don't want to go through this whole humiliating, debasing, degrading procedure. Don't want it. She can opt out at any point until a certain stage that we'll talk about in chapter 3. But until that stage, she can opt out at any time. Okay? So if she has not opted out, and if indeed she and the husband both want to go through with the procedure, so then we have in Mishnah, Mishnah, hey, okay, this, okay, standing her up, and what the Torah describes as uncovering or perhaps even disheveling her hair, okay, and Chazal make it yet more humiliating. She's stripped partly naked, okay, basically, okay, and put on display, okay, and that's pretty much where chapter 1 takes us up to. It takes us up to the point, okay, where she is placed there, standing there, uncovered in front of whoever is standing there. Okay, that's where chapter 1 ends. Okay, and chapter 2, okay, now there's more to chapter 1, but we won't discuss that now. Starting with Mishnah Zayin, chapter 1 moves in a different direction. It departs from the narrative. This is one of the places where the Mishnah really departs from the narrative to develop a different idea. Okay, but we'll get back to that later. We'll pick up with chapter 2. Chapter 2, we're back to the narrative. Haya mevi et minchata. Now, when she and her husband came up to Yerushalayim, they brought a meal offering, a korban mincha. And the Mishnah starts off by describing that meal offering and by pointing out, again based on psukim, but Chazal present this idea more pointedly, that this is a meal offering like no other meal offering in the Torah. It's a very different meal offering. For one thing, it's brought from barley rather than from wheat. That's not entirely unique. Anyone know which other meal offering is brought from barley? You all really ought to know this, especially this time of year, and I just gave you a very broad hint.
It's the Omer.
The Omer. The Omer offering is from barley. Okay, and that's because it's the offering of the barley harvest. But this is a barley offering, as the Mishnah explains at the end. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Yeshem Shem Ma'aseha Ma'aseh Vehema, Kach Korbana Ma'achal Behema. It's kind of measure for measure, because she acted in a, let's call it, subhuman fashion. So therefore, she brings the korban from subhuman grain. Okay, barley at the time of Chazal was generally regarded as animal fodder. Okay, people didn't usually make their food from barley. They made their food from wheat, not from barley. So wheat is considered to be a human grain, and barley is considered to be a subhuman grain. So subhuman activity, again, presumption of guilt, leads to a subhuman form of grain grain offering. Okay, so we've described the grain offering. Okay, and then there's more of a description of the procedure, what they would do with this grain offering, how it would be offered. Okay, that's the first part of chapter 2. Okay, the second part of chapter 2 goes into how the bitter waters were prepared. So in Mishnah 2 already, we talk about bringing an earthenware vessel, filling it with water, and then taking dirt from the sanctuary and placing it in there. It's interesting that just think about all the sacred items that go into the Sotah procedure. We started off with a meal offering, and now we're taking dirt from the floor of the sanctuary that's mixed in with the bitter waters. And then in Mishnah Gimel, we have the other component of the water, which is the scroll. Okay, so we have the writing of the scroll. What exactly gets written? The erasing of the scroll, okay, into the water. So now we have the two main components of the water. The water contains dirt from the floor of the sanctuary and the erased scroll, okay, the ink from the erased scroll. And then we come to the third part of the chapter in Mishnah Hey, okay, which is Almahi Omeret Amen Amen. Okay, the oath. The Kohen administers the oath. So the Kohen recites the language of the oath and the curse, and she has to then say, as the Torah says, Amen, Amen. And there's some drashot now on why the doubled language of Amen. But basically, these are the three parts of the chapter. The meal offering, the bitter waters, and the bitter waters include the writing and erasing of the scroll. And the third part is the oath. The oath, let's note, also is the name of God. So you have the name of God erased in the water. You have the name of God. That's a central feature of her oath. Okay, you have a sacrifice. Okay, there's a lot of temple. Okay, God is very deeply involved in this procedure, and that's a point that we will be coming back to. So now let's just try to characterize what we've seen in the two chapters, chapter 1 versus chapter 2. Chapter 1 ends before the Sotah procedure really gets underway. Okay, the real part of the Sotah procedure is the three features of the Sotah procedure that are mentioned in chapter 2. Okay, the offering, the bitter water, and the oath. Those are the three main parts of the Sotah procedure, and they're all presented in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is all preliminaries. But Chazal sort of dramatize the preliminaries to include various details that the Torah doesn't mention. It includes the involvement of a local court, the involvement of the high court in Jerusalem, and standing the woman up for a kind of public humiliation before the procedure actually gets underway. So I would say chapter 1 is really the preliminaries. Chapter 2 is the components of the Sotah rite. Okay, so you have the preliminaries in chapter 1, the components in chapter 2, and now let's move into chapter 3. Okay, what do we get up to in chapter 3? Haya notel et minchata mitoch kfifa mitzrit. Okay, now we're the offering was prepared in chapter 2, was put into this Egyptian wicker basket. And now in chapter 3, it's now taken out of the wicker basket in order to offer it. Okay, so now we've had the preliminaries, we've had the components, all the components are in place in chapter 2, and now in chapter 3, the procedure is getting underway. Note again the narrative mood in which it's being described. Okay, so we describe in Mishnah 1 and 2, the Kohen takes the offering, he places it on her hands. You do tnufa. Okay, tnufa looks more or less like the non-nuim of the lulav. Okay, forward and back, to the sides, up and down. Okay, okay, that's what you do. As you wave the offering before God in the courtyard of the temple, then you have the Korban Mincha proceedings in Mishnah 3, which look pretty similar. In this regard, it's similar to other Korbanot Mincha, pretty similar. And then you have an interesting dispute here in Mishnah 3, whether the drinking precedes the offering or the offering precedes the drinking. And the truth is, when you look at the psukim in the Torah, I'm not going to take the time to look at these psukim together with you, but the source sheets that were sent out to you have the whole passage, so you can read it on your own and see. It actually says twice that she drinks the water. Once before the meal offering is offered and once afterwards. And basically, that's the dispute here. One of those two psukim is telling you the chronology, telling you how the procedure actually takes place. And the other one, you have to find some reason why it's there as well. But you have a dispute. Is the first one the chronological one, and the second one is there for some other kind of literary reason? Or is it the second one that's chronological and the first one is there for some kind of literary function? That's basically the dispute. And when you look at the psukim, you can see that very readily. But there's more to say about that dispute. If we have time, we'll come back and say a few words about it later on. But in any event, we have these two parts of the procedure and a question about how they are interacting, the offering and the drinking. So this is the actual procedure. So we've had chapter 1, preliminaries, chapter 2, components, chapter 3, the mainstay of the real procedure. She drinks the water. She brings the offering. The oath she's already taken in chapter 2. Now, that's also part of the proceedings, but that was part of chapter 2. But here, the main two parts, the offering and the drinking, those are in chapter 3. And then chapter 3 continues with the results. What happens after she drinks the water? Okay, so so Mishnah 4 tells us the result. Okay, before she's even finished drinking, her face turns green, her eyes bulge out of their sockets, and becomes filled with bulging veins, and everyone there says, get her out of here fast so that she doesn't contaminate the temple courtyard. Because that's part of the hazard here. If she dies, she will contaminate the courtyard, okay, which obviously we want to avoid. And now comes perhaps the biggest novel point that we've encountered. Im yesh la zchut hayta tolala. First we say she doesn't even finish drinking and she's already about to die. And then we say, but if she has some kind of merit, that will, okay, that will delay. Okay, no, it won't exonerate her, but it will delay the effects. Okay, and that in turn is the subject of some dispute, because in Mishnah, hey, says no, you there can't be any delay. Can't say if she is a meritorious individual, then even if she's guilty of this particular sin, she won't die right away. She'll have a reprieve for a certain amount of time. Rabbi Shimon says, if you say that, then imata omer azchut tola b'mayim hamarim madhata tamayim b'fnei kol hanashim hashotot. You lose the whole impact. You lose the whole effect. So, if she has merit, that's not going to cut any ice here. Okay, she still has to get her just punishment like anyone else, with or without the merit. But it's interesting, it's only Rabbi Shimon who thinks that. You go back to Mishnah 4, the majority opinion is, yes, it will. So what about saying, well, that will cast dispersions on the effect of the waters? Okay, some sages also say it will also cast dispersions on some of the women who came out without any ill effects. People say, oh, were they really innocent, or was the punishment just delayed? So you lose on both ends, okay, if you do that. Nevertheless, the majority opinion seems to be very insistent on that point. Yes, merit will delay the results. Okay, so have an interesting dispute. Obviously, has ramifications that go beyond just the Sotah issue, and indeed, as a kind of footnote to that discussion, you have one of the most famous discussions, perhaps the most famous discussion in all of Tractate Sotah. Okay, people who've probably never even heard of Tractate Sotah know about this Mishnah. Should women study Torah? Ben Azai says, absolutely. So that if indeed her punishment is delayed, she'll know why. She won't say, I see these bitter waters, they're not worth anything. They don't, they're not all they're cracked up to be. I drank it and look at me, nothing happened. And as I said, no. Make sure she's well educated so she'll know that if she drinks the water and nothing happened, she'll know why. Yeah, she had the merit of studying Torah, so that delayed it. And since she studied Torah, she knows that that's what delayed it. Okay? And Rabbi Eliezer, who famously says, whoever teaches his daughter Torah is as though he's teaching her tiflut. Let me see how they translate tiflut here. Promiscuity. That's the correct translation. He's always teaching her promiscuity. And I think Rabbi Eliezer is directly relating to Ben Azai, saying, you say it's good for her to be well educated, so that if she comes up for this divine judgment, she'll know how to interpret the results. And Rabbi Eliezer said, on the contrary, by teaching her Torah, you're going to teach her how to work the system. Going to teach her how to work around the system. Exactly the wrong strategy. Okay, so I think that's the basic dispute here. But of course, as we know, the Talmud understood this as a much more fundamental dispute, not only in the context of Sotah. Is it a good idea to teach women Torah or not? Here's the classic locus for that. And it's interesting, of course, that the Mishnah, before bringing Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is very often recorded in the halachic literature. But before we get to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the Mishnah has this other opinion that completely disagrees Rabbi Eliezer on that point. Okay, so in any event, let's get back to our characterization of chapter 3. So chapter 3 is about the main parts of the procedure, the sacrifice, the meal offering, and the drinking, and the results. And then chapter 3 digresses a bit to reflect back on the meal offering and talk about different cases where the meal offering, instead of being consumed, which is what usually happens to meal offerings, in some cases the meal offering would have to be burnt, whether because it became defiled, so a defiled sacrifice is burnt, okay, or because the woman, after bringing the meal offering, but before you've actually reached the point in the procedure where the meal offering is actually offered, she says, that's it. Let's end these proceedings now. I want out. Okay, so if that happens, then the meal offering is burnt. And then later on, we get to, and if she is the wife of a Kohen, the meal offering is burnt, because since most meal offerings are eaten by Kohanim, when Kohanim bring meal offerings, the Torah says to burn them. Meal offerings are burnt. They're burnt on the altar. And that's true of a Sotah who's married to a Kohen. Her meal offering will also be burnt because it's really her husband's sacrifice, or at least partially her husband's sacrifice. So that also gets burnt. So we have different cases of it being burnt. And from there, there's a kind of segue of the Mishnah. This is one of those cases where the Mishnah associatively departs from the main topic and goes into an adjunct topic, okay, and that is differences between men and women in all kinds of areas. Okay, again, if we have time, we can make a few observations about those differences and how they fit into the overall scheme of Tractate Sotah. But I think that gives us the basic narrative. Chapter 1, preliminaries. Chapter 2, components. Chapter 3, the main part of the procedure. No, it's the climax of the procedure with the two main parts of it. The results and the debate about how variable these results may or may not be. And then some reflections about the Korban Mincha, different occasions where it will be burnt instead of consumed by the Kohanim, and that segueing into differences between men and women. Okay, so those are like secondary topics. But the main topic is the main parts of the procedure and the results of the procedure. That's the main body of the chapter. And that ends the narrative. And now chapter 4 is more reflective and goes back to apodictic, or to some extent casuistic laws, which is the usual style of the Mishnah. Okay, and what we're essentially told about in chapter 4 is which women are subject to drinking sotah. Okay, so we start off with the question of at what stage of the marriage, okay, a betrothed woman does not drink the sotah water. She doesn't receive her ketubah because since she has cast very, very serious suspicion on herself by her behavior, she forfeits the ketubah and she has no way of getting it back. Okay? In order to go through with the sotah procedure, she has to be beyond betrothed. She has to be nisu'ah. In other words, she has to actually have begun living with her husband. Shomeret Yavam, okay, is in a way like the Arusa. She was married to a husband, he died, And now, since she didn't have children, now she has to undergo a levirate marriage, yibum, with her brother-in-law, and it hasn't happened yet. Okay, so she's not really married to him, but she has a kind of quasi-marital bond with her yavam, okay, with the brother-in-law who will be performing the levirate marriage. So she's also not subject to these rules, right? Then the Mishnah goes on to marriages that are problematic. What if there is a marriage that ought not to have happened? A Kohen marries a Grusha, an Almanah marries a Kohen Gadol. Okay, that's Parshat HaShavua. Parshat HaShavua that we just read on Shabbat from Parshat Emor. These are forbidden marriages. Okay, or forbidden marriages for a regular Israelite, like a mamzeret, okay, or a Bat Yisrael marrying a mamzer. Interestingly, if a mamzer marries a mamzeret, that's a legitimate marriage, and that would have the Sotah procedure. But these forbidden marriages do not. Okay, that's the first Mishnah. And then we have additional cases, lo shotot v'lo notlot ktuba. Okay, and we again have the list of women who basically opt out, or the husband opts out, either by admitting guilt, okay, or witnesses come and establish her guilt, or if she just says, I don't want to do this, or if her husband says, I don't want to do this, or interestingly, if her husband had relations with her between the time she became a Sotah and the time she arrives in Yerushalayim. Remember from chapter 1, that's why we sent the two Talmidei Chachamim with them to chaperone them and make sure they don't succumb to temptation and perhaps have relations along the way. Okay? And if that happened, it contaminates the whole procedure. So once that happens, we say, forget it. We're not going through with that procedure. Or we add, what happens if the husband dies? In the course of the procedure, the husband dies. Okay, so she certainly doesn't drink. That Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree. Question is she entitled to her ketubah? Because she can say, I was willing to go through with this. If I'd gone through with it and been exonerated, I'd get my ketubah back. Why should I lose out? Just because you don't let me drink, I should lose my ketubah? Okay, that's what Beit Shammai seem to think, but Beit Hillel, interestingly, disagree with that. That's an interesting dispute, but we won't have a chance to look into it further. Okay, here are other rabbinically prohibited marriages. Okay, a person should not marry a woman who's already pregnant from her previous husband. Okay, that's why, okay, we have 3 months in between marriages to make sure she's not pregnant. You're not supposed to marry her if she is pregnant, or if she's nursing a baby from a previous marriage. That is also prohibited rabbinically. So, okay, so there's a question whether that will preclude drinking the bitter waters. Okay, so up till now, the whole chapter has been all about who does and does not drink bitter waters, going from what stage of the marriage are we in, to whether it's a permissible or prohibited marriage, or cases where the procedure was halted in the middle for one reason or another, and the chapter ends with the Beit Din recurring, but in a very interesting connection. Elu sheBeit Din mekanin lahem. When the husband is not available, let's say usually, how does the Sotah procedure happen? The husband picks up that the wife's behavior is rather suspicious, particularly regarding a particular man. He then admonishes her, the kinui, in front of witnesses, and she ignores it and checks into a hotel room with the man. That's how it normally happens. What if the husband is incapacitated or otherwise unable to fulfill that function? And it's like common knowledge that this woman is acting promiscuously and the husband isn't around or he's unavailable. So the Beit Din can step in and admonish her. Okay, and then the Mishnah says, Lo lashkota fosla miktubata. When the Beit Din admonishes her, so if she ignores it, then she will forfeit her ktubah. The same as if the husband had admonished her. But if she says, no, I want my ktubah back, let me go and drink the bitter water, you say, sorry, husband can do that. The court can't act in loco husband for that purpose. Okay, so that's how we end. And it's interesting that we started the Sotah procedure with the husband coming before the court, and here at the end of chapter 4, we conclude a reflective chapter on women who, for some reason or another, will not go through with the Sotah procedure. We conclude it with the Beit Din again playing a role here, stepping into the shoes of the husband in a certain way, in certain circumstances. Okay, that is our overview of the 4 chapters. Okay, so now, time permitting, I'd like to go back and take a closer look at some of the details that we've been looking at. And the main thing I want to be absolutely certain that we deal with is in chapter 1. Because chapter 1 has a very, very interesting digression. Go back to chapter 1, take a look at that digression, and then think about what that digression is doing here in Tractate Sotah. Here's where it begins. Bamidash adam moded ba modedin. Okay, what we call measure for measure. Okay, with the measure a person measures, he is measured with it, meaning that what happens to a person is richly deserved. And richly deserved not just in the sense of severity. You did a great mitzvah, so you get a great reward. Or you committed a great Aveirah, so you get a great punishment. It's not just in terms of, let's call it quantity, but midah keneged midah is generally understood, and that's the way it's presented here as well, as referring not only to quantity, but also to kind, to type. Whereas the punishment fits the crime. Take a well-known example from the Torah, and that is when the Egyptians were drowned in the sea. That is considered to be a midah keneged midah punishment, because what were the Egyptians guilty of?
Drowning the Hebrew boys.
Right, drowning the Hebrew infants in the Nile. So the ones who drowned the Hebrew infants in the Nile were later punished. By the way, another punishment was the first of the plagues was turning the Nile into blood. That's also very symbolic, right? They shed the blood of many innocent babies, okay, in the Nile, and so the first plague is to turn the Nile into blood. And the very last plague is to drown the Egyptians in the sea. Okay, so that's measure for measure. So you see how appropriate the punishment is to the crime, but it can also be for good. You see how appropriate the reward is for the mitzvah. Okay, so now we illustrate that with the Sotah. And interestingly, we illustrate it by talking about the preliminaries. First of all, about the preliminaries. He kishtat atzma la'avera makom nivla. Okay, she decorated herself in order to entice her paramour. Okay, so the omnipresent nivla is more than rendered her unattractive. Okay, it rendered her, it debased her. Okay, so we really have an explanation here for why it is that we have this whole procedure described in this chapter of humiliating and debasing her. Okay, it's considered to be measure for measure. Okay, and then we jump to the end of the procedure. The act of intercourse, okay, starts with the thigh and afterwards the belly. Okay, and so the punishment is the fichach tilkeh hayarech tchila, okay, v'achar kach habeten. Okay, that's where the Torah describes her death. Okay, that her thigh collapses and her stomach is split, her belly is split. Ushar aguf, shar kol aguf lo palat. So these are measure for measure. It's interesting that chapter 2 continues the theme of measure for measure. We already noted this. She brings a sacrifice of barley, which is animal fodder, because she has behaved in a subhuman fashion. Okay, so measure for measure is first of all presented here in the context of the Sotah. And from here, the Mishnah goes on to develop this theme of midah keneged midah. Okay, before looking at that, let's think a bit about why. Why is it important already in the first chapter of Tractate Sotah for the Mishnah to present this idea that the Mishnah is not usually that interested in rationales for the mitzvot. Usually doesn't tell us this mitzvah or this procedure, okay, or this ruling is based on some kind of theological notion. That's not a usual thing for the Mishnah to get into. Why specifically regarding Sotah would the Mishnah be interested in presenting it in this fashion? What's unique about Sotah? Yes, Emily.
I was going to say it's a judicial procedure based on a miracle.
Yes, very good. Okay. What's unique about Sotah is that God is involved. Okay, as we saw going through the Mishnayot, God is involved not only in the result, he's very invested in the procedure. It happens in the temple, okay, dirt from the floor of the temple, God's name is erased, God's name is evoked, a sacrifice is offered to God. God is heavily invested in this procedure, and the result is divine. Okay, as we noted in our previous discussion, unlike ordeals around the world in other cultures, the Sotah is not subject to anything that is physically dangerous, physically unpleasant, I'm sure drinking the bitter waters cannot have been a pleasant experience, but it's not dangerous. It's not something that ought to kill you. Okay, so unlike most ordeals in which you subject yourself to a dangerous procedure, and the miracle will be if you're saved. Here, the woman, and the unique in the entire Torah, the woman subjects herself to a physically neutral procedure. It's dangerous only because it invokes divine involvement. And it's precisely because God is so deeply involved in this proceeding that the Mishnah wants to note how central the theme of midah keneged midah is in this procedure. Okay, but now the Mishnah very interestingly moves on to all kinds of examples of midah keneged midah from the Tanakh. It starts with Shimshon. Shimshon followed his eyes, and therefore the Plishtim put out his eyes. Okay, Avshalom, okay, was extremely vain about his hair, and so his demise was because, okay, anyone who remembers the biblical story, he's riding on his donkey, and his hair gets caught up in the branches of a tree, and he swept off the donkey and left hanging there from the branches of the tree, where Yoav comes and kills him. And that's also involved in the number 10. Okay, he had relations with 10 of his father's concubines when he tried to usurp the throne, and therefore 10 people under the command of Yoav then ran him through with their spears. So that's 10 opposite 10. Okay, and something further about Avshalom. But then we move on. We've had two negative examples of midah keneged midah, and now we have two positive examples of midah keneged midah. Miriam, who waited for Moshe, right? When Moshe was put in the Nile, Miriam waited to see what would happen, and she was the one responsible for having him returned to her mother. So, as a reward for that, when she was stricken with tzara'at, her the people, the camp, waited for her. Okay, waited for her for a whole week until she was healed. So she waited a short amount of time, and the reward was even greater. Okay, the camp waited for her for a whole week. And then Yosef, okay, led the burial procession for Yaakov. He led the entire proceedings. And so the reward is that who attended to his bones being transported back to Eretz Canaan to be buried in the land of Israel? No less than Moshe. And Moshe, because he attended to the bones of Yosef, so attended to Moshe's burial? God himself. Okay? Now, why are we interested in all of these biblical models? There are quite a few things we could say about that. Let's just pick up on a couple of points. One of them is that Moshe, in the case of Moshe, you see God directly rewarding Moshe. In other words, we're again moving from results that are all on the human level. For Shimshon's punishment came at the hand of the Philistines. Avshalom's punishment came at the hands of Yoav and his underlings. Okay, Miriam's reward came at the hands of Am Yisrael. Okay, Yosef's reward came at the hand of Moshe. Moshe's reward was from God himself. So the same way that the Sotah, okay, starts with a human proceeding and then leads to a divine intervention. The divine judgment is invoked by the human proceeding. Okay, this whole procession of Miriam, Yosef, Moshe, and then ultimately God. Okay, you move from retribution or reward by human beings to reward at the hands of God himself. So I think that's one point that we can see. But there's another very crucial point that I think we have to note here. Okay, and let's look briefly at the source sheet. Okay, on the source sheet, we can see that this section, okay, the section, the talk that we just looked at now, the section about the biblical models for measure, echoes in many respects the first 7 Mishnahs of the chapter. Shimshon halach achar einav. Shimshon followed his eyes. The Sotah, we say about the Sotah that she is a public spectacle. She's put on public display, and people are invited to come and see her humiliation. Avshalom glorified himself with his hair. Okay, let's look at the Sotah. The Sotah, okay, has, if she has beautiful hair, the Mishnah says, then it shouldn't be uncovered, because the point is to humiliate her, not to glorify her. And if she has beautiful breasts, then those should not be uncovered. And that reminds us, Liba Na'er reminds us of Avshalom, who stole 3 hearts, as it were. As that's called to deceive. He deceived 3 people, but the term the Mishnah uses is, and it's taken from the Tanakh, he stole the heart of his father, of Beit Din, and of Israel. Well, guess what? The father is mentioned in the Sotah. When the court admonishes the Sotah, the court tells her things that she is not worthy to hear, or her father's household. The theme seems to be Sotah dishonors not only herself, but her household, her father's home. So Avshalom stole the heart of his father. He stole the heart of Beit Din. Beit Din was very much involved in the Sotah procedure. Okay, and finally, Hamakom Gila Aleha, Midah Keneged Midah, tells us that the omnipresent has ferreted her out, has revealed her. And the same Makom is the one who gives Moshe his reward. So you see that all of these cases are selected in such a way as to allude literarily to the Sotah proceedings. And let's conclude with the following thought, which will explain why the Mishnah is interested in these connections. Let's look a little more closely at the cases. Shimshon. What was Shimshon's sin? Halach achar einav. He married foreign women. He married Philistine women. It was sexual indiscretion. Shimshon succumbed to his sexual appetite. That was his sin. Halach achar einav. He couldn't control his sexual urge. Avshalom, among other things, he was not only vain about his hair, but he also had relations with 10 of his father's concubines on a roof. He made a public display of it. Look, I'm king. My father's concubines now are my concubines. That was part of Avshalom's sin. So the 2 people selected for negative measure are two people who are both guilty of sexual transgressions. And now who stands opposite them in terms of merit? Okay, let's look back again at who stands opposite them. Here we go. Yeah. Okay, we have Miriam, Yosef, Moshe. What does Miriam represent? What was her great merit? Miriam's great merit was not just saving a baby, who also turned out to be the savior of Israel. Miriam's great merit was preserving the Jewish family. It was taking Moshe, who was about to be lost, either drowned or taken off to an Egyptian family, and bringing him back into the Jewish people. That was Miriam's merit. In the Talmud, Miriam is described as the one who persuaded her father to remarry Yocheved, because Jews were ceasing to get married after all their babies were being thrown into the Nile. And Miriam came and said, your decree is worse than Pharaoh's. Miriam is the one who represents the preservation of the Jewish family. Yosef. Okay, Yosef, what was Yosef's greatest merit? Resisting the blandishments of the wife of Potiphar. Whereas Miriam and Yosef are the exact antithesis of the Sotah. The two biblical figures who represent negative midah keneged midah are figures who represent the same succumbing to sexual urges that marks the Sotah. The figures who are meritorious and who receive divine reward are figures who represent the preservation of the Jewish family, and also reflect something else: the national repercussions of preserving the Jewish family. Had it not been for Miriam, Yosef, and Moshe, there would be no Jewish people. Their commitment to Jewish family, okay, is what ultimately preserves Jewish peoplehood. So midah keneged midah now is seen as being focused very heavily in the direction of family purity. Family impurity, God punishes measure for measure. Family purity, God rewards measure for measure. We'll close with that thought for tonight, but we aren't finished with this thought, because the later chapters of Masechet Sotah are going to return us to this section of Sotah in some very interesting and surprising ways. Erev Tov and Shavua Tov to all.
Thank you, Rabbi Avie Walfish. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. That was quite remarkable. Yeah, so the schedule is a bit, we had a bit of an adjustment, so I'm just putting the link to the YouTube video of the previous session in the chat in case you need to get caught up. But aside from that, that's all. And looking forward to seeing you next week. Have a good night. Have a good afternoon.